In 20 years, a poor, unknown boy became emperor of nearly all of Europe and wrote a code of law still in force today in dozens of countries. Then, in a matter of months, he lost everything and died a prisoner on an isolated rock island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. If you were a 19-year-old recruit in 1805, marching behind him across the whole of Europe, you wouldn't have known whether you were following the greatest military genius of the century, or the man who would lead you to freeze to death in the Russian snow. Both things were true at once. Napoleon was born on the 15th of August, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica. A quirk of the calendar decided his nationality. The island had been sold to France by Genoa only a year before. Born 12 months earlier, he would have been Italian, and this story wouldn't exist at all. His family was Corsican nobility, a surname and a coat of arms, but no fortune at all. 8 siblings fought over bread in a cramped house in Ajaccio. His father, a modest lawyer, used the few connections he had to get his son something money alone couldn't buy, a place at a military academy on the French mainland. At 9 years old, Napoleon was sent to the military academy at Brienne, in France, speaking halting French with a thick Corsican accent. His classmates, sons of the wealthy nobility, mocked him for his accent and his short stature. He responded by shutting himself away with books on mathematics, geometry, and military history. Napoleon wasn't the most popular boy at school. He was the most studious. He devoured artillery treatises while the others socialized. He graduated from the Royal Military School of Paris and became a second lieutenant of artillery at 16. An isolated boy with a strange accent now wore the officer's uniform of the very army that had taken him in. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded and beheaded the old order of the nobility. For most of France, it was chaos and blood. For a penniless Corsican lieutenant with no powerful patron, it was the latter he'd been missing. Suddenly, a nobody could rise by merit and by cannon fire. In 1793, Royalist rebels handed the port of Toulon over to the English fleet. Young Captain Napoleon devised the artillery plan that drove the English out of the city. At 24, he became a brigadier general, the youngest general in all of revolutionary France. 2 years later, in Paris, a royalist mob marched to overthrow the government. Napoleon was handed the defense at the last minute and answered with a volley of artillery against the crowd in the streets. A whiff of grape shot, he would call it later. The Republic survived, and his name became known across the entire capital. In 1796, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior, while connected to Paris's political elite. Days after the wedding, he was given command of the Army of Italy, a ragged, starving band that hadn't been paid in months. No one expected much from him. The older generals mocked the appointment. A 26-year-old boy, better known for surviving a riot than for winning any real wars. He arrived at the ragged Italian headquarters promising glory and plunder to the starving soldiers. Within a few weeks, he would prove he wasn't bluffing. The Italian campaign, between 1796 and 97, became legend almost overnight. Napoleon faced Austrian armies that were larger and better equipped, and won through sheer speed. He marched too fast to be predicted, concentrated his entire force on a single point of the enemy line, and struck before they could react. At Lodi, he led the attack on the bridge personally. At Arcole, he seized a flag and ran ahead of his soldiers under heavy fire, the scene that would become famous forever. At Rivoli, he crushed an Austrian army that outnumbered his own. 3 victories in a row, one name rising, Bonaparte. He became a national hero before he turned 30, without asking anyone in Paris for permission. He negotiated the peace treaty of Campo Formio with Austria entirely on his own, against the wishes of his own government. A field general was now dictating foreign policy. No one in Paris knew anymore who answered to whom. Alongside his cannons, Napoleon brought journalists and a field printing press. Exaggerated war bulletins, heroic portraits, dispatches he edited himself. Piece by piece, it all built the myth of the invincible general. Long before social media, he already understood. Whoever controls the story controls the power. In 1798, Napoleon set sail for Egypt with a grand plan: cut off the British route to India and open a new French empire in the east. He brought 35,000 soldiers and more than 160 scientists, artists, and scholars, the so-called savants. Facing the pyramids of Giza, with the Mamluk army in sight, he is said to have shouted to his soldiers, "40 centuries look down upon you." The Battle of the Pyramids was a swift, one-sided massacre. Within a few hours, Napoleon controlled Cairo and seemed to own all of Egypt. But while he was winning on land, the English Admiral Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay and destroyed almost all of it in a single night. Without ships, Napoleon's army was trapped in Egypt, cut off from France, surrounded by a sea entirely controlled by the English. It was a French officer, digging fortifications near the town of Rosetta, who found a slab of dark stone covered in 3 different scripts. Decades later, it would become the key that finally deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs, the single greatest accidental scientific find of the whole expedition. Isolated, with word that the political situation in Paris had turned chaotic, Napoleon made a decision some would call cowardice and others sheer genius instinct. He abandoned his own army in Egypt and slipped back to France in secret in 1799 with a handful of officers. The army he left behind would hold out 2 more years in Egypt before surrendering to the English. But for Napoleon, none of that mattered anymore. He was back in Paris, and the Directory, the weak, corrupt government running France, could barely hold on for another month. Paris, in 1799, was a cauldron of failed coups, inflation, and endless war. The general who had defeated Austria and occupied Egypt returned as the only figure who seemed big enough to fix the chaos. All that was left was a coup. On the 9th of November, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire on the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon and his allies overthrew the Directory in a mix of political intrigue and military intimidation inside Parliament itself. He emerged as first consul. At 30, he ruled all of France. Months later, to secure his newly won power, Napoleon crossed the snow-covered Alps with his army, bound for Italy, in a gesture that became a symbol before it became a victory. He won narrowly at Marengo, turning the battle around at the last hour, and David would immortalize that crossing in one of the most recognizable paintings in history. Back in Paris, Napoleon stopped being just a general and became a lawmaker. He gathered jurists to write a new civil code, passed in 1804. Equality before the law, guaranteed property rights, church separated from state. Decades later, he would sum up his life's whole pride in a single sentence. "My true glory is not the 40 battles I won. It is my civil code," he would write years later on St. Helena. Today, versions of that code form the basis of law in dozens of countries, from Latin America to continental Europe. None of his military victories lasted as long as those pages of law. The same package of reforms brought the Bank of France, public lycées, a concordat that made peace with the Catholic Church, and the Legion of Honor, a decoration awarded for merit, not noble blood. For a man mocked his whole life for having no fortune, meritocracy was personal. In 1804, the French Senate offered Napoleon the title he had always wanted, Emperor. He accepted, but demanded a ceremony to match at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with Pope Pius VII himself brought from Rome to bless the coronation. The whole world would be watching. On the day of the ceremony, the 2nd of December, 1804, Napoleon made the boldest gesture of his life. He took the crown before the Pope could place it on his head himself, and crowned himself. The message was clear. That power came not from God, nor from the Church. It came from him. David captured the next moment. The new emperor, already crowned, placing the crown on Josephine as empress, while the Pope sat reduced to a spectator behind him, empty-handed. The canvas is nearly 10 meters wide. Around him grew what would become known as the Grande Armée. Soldiers from all over France, veterans hardened by Italy and Egypt, driven by personal loyalty to the emperor and the promise of glory, land, and plunder. Soldier for soldier, it was the most feared army on the entire European continent. Soldiers could recognize him from a distance, through the smoke of the battlefield, just by his silhouette, the black bicorn hat worn sideways, over the worn gray coat covering his colonel's green uniform. Today, one of those original preserved hats still surprises visitors with how small it is. There was only one enemy Napoleon couldn't reach by land: England, shielded by the English Channel and by a navy that had ruled the seas for centuries. Throughout 1804 and 5, he gathered more than 150,000 men at the camp in Boulogne. All he needed was to control the sea. That crossing never happened. On the 21st of October, 1805, Admiral Nelson found the Franco-Spanish fleet off Cape Trafalgar and destroyed almost all of it, with a bold maneuver that split the enemy line in two. England would rule the seas for the entire following century. Nelson died that same day, struck down by a French sharpshooter at the very peak of his own victory. He learned he had won before he died. For Napoleon, Trafalgar meant something final. He would never manage to invade England. If he wanted to dominate the continent, he would have to turn east for good. The 2nd of December, 1805, exactly 1 year after his own coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia near a town called Austerlitz, in what is today the Czech Republic. The battle would become known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, and it would be the masterpiece of his life. He faked weakness at the center of his line and deliberately gave up the Pratzen Heights, drawing the bulk of the Allied army there. When they took the bait, he launched his main attack right at that point, splitting the enemy in two. The sun rose strong that winter morning, the sun of Austerlitz he would cite for the rest of his life. It was a one-sided massacre. Austrians and Russians crushed within hours, the coalition against France collapsing on that same day. The following year, the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for nearly 1,000 years, was formally dissolved. The map of Central Europe would never be the same again. In October 1806, it was Prussia's turn. In two battles on the same day, near Jena and Auerstedt, the Prussian army, until then one of the most respected in Europe, was crushed within hours. Napoleon entered Berlin as a conqueror before the dust had even settled. At Friedland, in June 1807, Napoleon defeated the Russians so completely that Tsar Alexander sued for peace. The two emperors met on a raft built in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit, neutral ground, and there they divided the whole of Europe between the two of them. After Tilsit, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain to the Russian border, from Italy to Poland. It was the absolute peak. No French ruler, not even Louis XIV, had ever controlled so much European territory at once. Vassal kings, annexed territories, and allies formed a mosaic that only he could see whole. Unable to invade England by sea, Napoleon declared a different kind of war, the continental system, forbidding all of Europe under his control from trading with the English. The idea was to slowly strangle the British economy. In practice, the blockade also strangled his own European allies and planted resentment across the entire continent. On paper, the empire seemed all-powerful, but every annexed kingdom, every blockade imposed by force, every brother placed on a foreign throne stacked up resentments that would one day come due. The first crack would appear in a corner of Europe that no one, not even Napoleon himself, took seriously enough: Spain. In 1808, Napoleon deposed the Spanish monarchy and put his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne in Madrid. He expected a quiet vassal kingdom, like so many others he had already created. Instead, he found something no European army had faced on that scale before: an entire people refusing to obey. On the 3rd of May, 1808, French troops executed Madrid civilians who had risen up against the occupation the day before. The Spanish painter Goya would capture the scene in a painting that became an eternal symbol of resistance. Anonymous soldiers in a firing line, shooting at men with raised arms. What followed wasn't conventional warfare. It was guerrilla war, a word the Spanish conflict itself gave to the world, little war in Spanish. Ambushes, sabotage, entire populations armed against the occupier. Napoleon would later call Spain the Spanish ulcer, a wound that bled French troops and money for years, never healing. In 1809, Austria tried again. Napoleon won once more at Wagram, but this victory cost far more than the previous ones. Tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, on a single battlefield. The French army was still winning, but with less and less margin to spare, year after year. Meanwhile, in Paris, Napoleon's own foreign minister, Talleyrand, was already negotiating in secret with the enemies of the empire. He had quietly decided that the emperor's ambition had gone too far and started playing both sides, years before any defeat appeared on the horizon. With no heir after years of marriage, Napoleon divorced Josephine in 1809, in a ceremony he would later call the most painful of his life. Months later, he married for political gain Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, the royal blood the French Revolution would never have given him for free. On the 20th of March, 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, christened the King of Rome, heir to the largest empire Europe had seen since the Romans. For Napoleon, it was the absolute peak of everything. A dynasty secured, royal blood mixed with his own, a son to inherit everything he had built. But the empire had grown too vast to be held together by force of arms alone. In every occupied country, Napoleon unwittingly spread his own political weapon, nationalism, the idea that a people has the right to govern itself. Germans, Spaniards, Russians, all of them began turning against him the very banner the French Revolution had first raised. In Austria, Chancellor Metternich watched it all with cold patience, rebuilding alliances in secret, waiting for the right moment to turn the tables against the man who had married his own archduchess. The network that would one day bring Napoleon down was already being woven slowly, far from any battlefield. All that was missing was a mistake big enough to set it all alight at once. Napoleon, at the height of his own power, decided to settle the thing that bothered him most: a Russian Tsar who had stopped honoring the blockade against England. The decision that followed would be the biggest and the worst of his entire life. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia at the head of the largest army Europe had ever seen assembled, some 600,000 men, drawn from nearly every corner of the empire and its allied nations. It was a force so vast that it took whole days just to cross a single bridge. Rather than face that giant head-on, the Russian generals chose to retreat and burn everything along the way: crops, barns, entire villages reduced to ashes. Napoleon's great army pushed deeper and deeper into Russian territory, farther and farther from home, finding only scorched earth where it had expected food and shelter. On the 7th of September, 1812, near Borodino, the Russians finally stopped to fight. It was the bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic era, some 70,000 casualties combined on both sides, on a single field, in a single day. Napoleon won, but the Russian army escaped nearly intact, retreating once again. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting the Tsar's surrender. He found an empty city. Arsonists sent by the Russian governor had set entire districts on fire before fleeing. Moscow burned for days on end. No surrender message ever came. He waited, inside the Kremlin, for 5 whole weeks, in vain. In October, too late, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat. The Russian winter arrived before the army could get out of the territory. Temperatures as low as 30 degrees below zero, roads of ice, horses dying by the thousands in the snow. The same army that had marched triumphantly into Russia now was just trying to survive long enough to get out alive. Russian Cossacks harried the retreating columns day and night, striking at the weakest and most isolated groups. With no food for weeks, soldiers ate raw horse meat, burned their own uniforms to keep from freezing, and collapsed in the snow, never to rise again. The discipline of Europe's greatest army crumbled with every mile. The most desperate moment came at the Berezina River in November. French engineers built wooden bridges under constant enemy fire, standing chest-deep in freezing water, so the army could cross before the Russians closed the trap for good. Thousands died in the crossing, drowned, crushed, or torn apart by artillery. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia in June, only a few tens of thousands walked back out in December. Napoleon's great army, built over 15 years of unbroken victories, was practically annihilated in a single 6-month campaign. It was the greatest military disaster in European history up to that exact moment. Just as he had done in Egypt years before, Napoleon left the remains of his own army behind in the snow and raced by sleigh back to Paris. There were rumors of a coup against him, and he needed to reassert his power before news of the Russian disaster arrived first. He arrived in disguise, in secret, practically alone. The news, of course, got there anyway. All of Europe that had once bowed before Napoleon now watched his army reduced to frozen rags. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and England joined together in one final coalition. The man who had redrawn the entire map of Europe was now fighting just to survive. In October 1813, near Leipzig, the Allied forces, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden together, faced Napoleon in the largest battle Europe had seen up to that point. More than 500,000 soldiers engaged at once. It became known as the Battle of the Nations, and it ended in French defeat. In March 1814, the Allied armies entered Paris. With no support left, not even from his own marshals, Napoleon abdicated. As part of the peace settlement, they gave him the title of emperor, but of a tiny territory, the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, home to a few thousand people. An almost ironic exile. In February 1815, after less than a year on Elba, Napoleon escaped and landed on the French coast with a handful of loyal men. An entire regiment was sent to stop him. He walked alone toward them, opened his own coat, and said, "Here is your emperor. Kill me, if you wish." The soldiers lowered their muskets and shouted, "Long live the emperor." Regiment after regiment joined the march, without a single shot fired in 20 whole days. Napoleon reached Paris. The newly restored king fled before he even entered the city. The 100 Days, the final act of his life, had begun. On the 18th of June, 1815, near a small Belgian town called Waterloo, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Wellington and the Prussian General Blücher. The previous day's rain had soaked the ground, delaying the French attack by precious hours that would give the Prussians time to reach the field. Marshal Grouchy, sent to pursue the Prussians, never managed to stop Blücher from arriving. The French cavalry charges, launched without infantry support, broke against the English squares without ever breaking the line. By nightfall, with the Prussians on the field and defeat sealed, the Old Guard formed its last squares and withdrew fighting, refusing to surrender to the very end. Defeated, Napoleon surrendered to the English and was exiled to St. Helena, an isolated rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from any continent. There, under constant British guard, he spent his final years dictating his own memoirs. He died on the 5th of May, 1821, at 51 years old. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, though the theory of arsenic poisoning still divides historians to this day. The legacy remained: the civil code, the metric system, meritocracy, the modern nation-state, but also millions dead in the wars he waged. In 1840, his body was brought back to France, laid to rest at Les Invalides. So, how far can one man's will bend the world before the world pushes back? Napoleon was born poor, died a prisoner, and somewhere in between, redrew the whole of Europe. If this story hooked you, subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, would you have followed this man? And watch the video on Alexander the Great, popping up on your screen right now.